Good morning and welcome to another episode of Just One More Row, our little knitting vlog that we got going on here. And figured I'd give you guys a quick update on what's been going on. Now, in an attempt to keep some kind of format for the episodes going forward, I want to start off and show off any finished objects. In this case, there is one finished object. And you guys may recognize it as the shawl that I showed off last week. And kind of like, I guess this is how you're supposed to wear them. I don't know. I've never made one before, but I figured it was interesting and it was different. Last time, I think we had only done the gold border, and I finally finished off all the blue plus blue and white sections. So very quickly, I want to go over the construction of this, and I'm going to describe this kind of as you're going to see it on the screen, because it's a little bit difficult to describe otherwise. Okay, so as you see this on the screen, you have this gold section. And this gold section is going to be worked horizontally, back and forth. Whereas the blue and striped section would be worked vertically. Okay? So you have your stitches going in multiple directions. As far as would I make this pattern again? Absolutely not. It is not very well written. The finished object, I kind of like. So what you're supposed to do with this is you are supposed to work this gold edging, then work the center triangle, block it, make 3 more, so you have 4 triangles, seam them together, and then you're supposed to take a crochet silk thread and go around the entire outside. I have done that little crochet thread right there around the outside of this triangle, just to kind of neaten up the edges and help with any issues like any puckering or weird decreases, to go ahead and help take care of that. I went ahead and made this after, so here is kind of how this worked for me. After much frustration making this edging, because most of the pattern instructions are how to work the corners. Okay, so you can see that is what the corner looks like. And they are more complicated. You are increasing, but you don't increase at an even rate, so that is somewhat confusing. You increase 2 stitches every purl side, or the wrong side rows. You're increasing 2 purl stitches. The problem is that on the opposite end, you're also going to be decreasing 2 stitches every wrong side row, so 2 stitches every other row rather than 1 stitch every row. And what that does is it creates a very tight edge, but one edge is going to be tighter than the other. So blocking this got to be, we'll get to the blocking part. Anyway, so most of the instructions were for how to make this. You had, I'm trying to decide if the writer of this pattern like made the finished object and then wrote the pattern afterwards, trying to remember what they did, or simply wrote something down wrong, or the person who typed it up put it in wrong. I'm not sure. But in here you have rows that mysteriously are omitted. You have incorrect rows that are added, which will mess with your stitch counts because you have a scalloped edge, so you are constantly increasing and decreasing for that edge, which by the way actually surprisingly worked. I was dubious about that scalloped edge, but it did actually work. So you have that back and forth there for every row with the rows for the corners just mysteriously being added or omitted. Once you get up here to the actual body section, the stitch counts were not correct. And so there was, on my end, a lot of work a row, didn't work, take it apart, try to figure out where the problem was. And so you're trying to decipher a lace pattern that was not very well written. And not always using modern terminology. So that in of itself was a bit frustrating. But eventually, I got the whole thing done, all the way across to the other end. Again, you are decreasing, but you're decreasing at an uneven rate. So that does create a tighter edge. And what it does is on these corners, it's kind of hard to see because I hard blocked this, is that they want to curl like this because this edge is so tight that the fabric naturally wants to have a curl to it, which is a thing. In the body section of it, you're supposed to have 31 of these little eyelet rows. I ended up with like 34, and that is because when you go to do the moss ribbing section, which is this large wide blue stripe right here, you end up needing to pick up about 288 stitches, which is not an issue. I mean, this is done in a fairly fine gauge. It's meant to have a larger blanket. However, if you do the gold edging the way that it recommends, you will not have enough rows to evenly pick that up. And since not only are your regular knit stitches wider than your rows, moss stitch tends to be wider than a regular stockinette stitch or stocking stitch. So I had to lengthen the gold area in order just to have enough room to put the moss stitch on. And the moss stitches then worked at an even count. And then when you get up to for me, this striped lace section, that's an even number of stitches coming off of something odd. Yeah, it's a big old mess. The striped lace pattern here, there is again uneven decreasing, so you end up with these very strange areas of like blank space, so you don't cut off one of these lace triangles halfway through. It's just a big old mess. However, what I will say about it is that there's a great amount of potential within this. I just think that it needs some more refining. I think the person who originally got this done was able to make it work. This is a prize-winning pattern. Just perhaps the person who made it is not very good at writing patterns. That could always be a case. But there's lots and lots of potential in here. So I'm fiddling around with the idea of reworking this as a semicircular, so like a crescent shape shawl, keeping the same kind of triangle design in there, and then working out, a nice lace border with a scalloped edging. The math is being worked out. I have never done that before, so this is something very brand new to me. But that is the shawl there. I'll have the pattern linked below and with the original picture so you can kind of see what it was supposed to look like. If you would like to make this, I really recommend pull out a calculator and work it out. It will save you time and frustration. And something that you really learn whenever you're doing any kind of historic or vintage pattern is to work the math out in advance. Learn how things go together. So when you do come across something like this particular, what for me is a shawl, but was supposed to be a baby blanket, that you're able to catch problems before you're 30 hours into something. And then you just end up rage knitting the rest of it, because at this point you're 30 hours in and you're not going to give up, and that's just life. So what I did with this is I went ahead and I really to get my edges to lay flat, because I had what I called the reverse ruffle situation, because these corners, the decrease right here along this long edge is tighter than the scalloped edge. What the fabric wants to do naturally is to curl back on itself, which makes sense. There's just less string there. And the same thing with getting your moss stitch to lay evenly up against your stripes sections. I took this, soaked it and washed it for, what I do to block is I will take my finished object and then I soak it with a tiny amount of soap for at least 1 hour. Then kind of do the cat making biscuits sort of thing to wash them. I know that was a very technical explanation there. You'll have to excuse me. But then I rinse everything. I have an electric spinner, run it through that, and then I lay it out to block it. For sweaters, I don't necessarily even do that. I just wash it, run it through the spinner, and then I hang mine up. My sweaters tend to be very, very lightweight, so they dry very quickly. But for this, I pinned it out and I hard blocked it, which means that I stretched it basically as far as I could without snapping any threads. And pinned it out that way. I left it that way a little over 24 hours, and then I went ahead and when it was completely dry, then I unpinned it and I added my little gold, teeny tiny gold border in there to kind of cover up any oopses that may have happened. Anything that was uneven, I went ahead and put that on. Like I said, would I ever make it again? Not in its current form. Absolutely not. But I will take some of the ideas that were present in this, such as the lace edging, and this kind of triangular lace, and I may incorporate that into other projects. That's one thing to remember whenever you're making anything and you don't like it, or the process was very frustrating. There's a lesson to be learned in that. Sometimes our great lessons are how not to do things. And I learned a lot about how not to do things with this shawl. So I'm very happy to have learned those lessons. Just take it from me, do the math ahead of time. Normally vintage patterns are not this bad, but that one was pretty bad. Anyway, moving on to the other vintage pattern that I have been working on that is not incredibly frustrating is the Matron's Lacy blouse. I haven't made a huge amount of progress on this. I do have the sleeve cap almost completely done. So, very quick breakdown of the construction of this. You will knit the collar. From there, you're going to make 2 shoulder straps, one on either side. You are then going to pick up and knit downward from your collar and shoulder straps all the way down the front and also on the back to your desired length, then put on your ribbing. Then you will come back and pick up the stitches along that shoulder strap, and then you are going to knit the sleeve cap on, picking up and knitting as you go so that your sleeve is knitted on. Now the directions for the sleeve itself get a little weird. I can't tell if it's supposed to be done in the round or if it's supposed to be knitted flat. The cuff is definitely knitted in the round because it gives directions for how to do that. But I'm not sure about the sleeve itself. So I'm going to work on figuring that out. It does not... So when looking at vintage patterns, one of the things to remember that the idea of circular needles like we have today, where you have your needle and then you have a cord of some variety and then you have the other end of your needle. Those are relatively recent inventions. Did they have them 100 years ago? Well, technically, but they were not very good. I've seen like one picture, and that was an odd thing because it had the needle and then it had like an actual hinge then it had a cord, then it had another actual hinge, and then the needle. So while technically it does meet the requirements of being a circular needle, no, not very functional. So most vintage or historic patterns were done on straight needles. Also, having super long double points, from what I can gather, was more of a regional thing. Mostly and I say this because, again, assumption of knowledge, people wouldn't write things in a pattern if they assumed that their audience would already know. And given the level of instructions that they give for anything worked in the round that is not a sock, and even with socks there tend to be some heavier instructions. Because of the amount of instructions, that leads me to believe that this was not common knowledge, so they gave you extra instructions because the writers assumed that their audience would not know. Does that make sense? Right? I give you extra instructions if I assume you don't know how to do something. I would not give you extra instructions on something that you should already know how to do. That's kind of the mental thesis I have going. If anybody knows anything different, please let me know. I would love to be able to find out about it. So back to this particular Matron's Lacy blouse. The cuff is definitely done in the round because it does give very specific, this pattern does give specific instructions for how many stitches you're supposed to have on each of your each of your double pointed needles. And I'll reread for the sleeves because the sleeves are going to be 15 inches wide, and just based on my experience, they didn't really give instructions for double point needles for anything quite that wide normally. But I do have another sweater where they did do that, but it's using much larger needles, so I'm not really sure. In either case, being able to pick up and knit on the sleeve as you go, one, has created a very nice edging to this. I went ahead and just slipped each stitch, or a stitch at the beginning of every row. So it has made picking up and knitting things on much easier. I highly recommend that. The other modification that I did make to this is that I've added one stitch into the front, one into the back, just to make the lace pattern symmetrical. And I've done basically the same thing to the sleeve, added in one stitch simply to make the pattern symmetrical. But so far, it's actually coming along fairly well. The last time I've kind of tried this on, the neck fit wonderfully, the chest is going to fit wonderfully. With this particular pattern, the size of the back and the size of the front are different. So that's another thing that you're going to have to keep in mind with a lot of vintage, with some, let me caveat that, with some vintage patterns, that you can't assume that the front and the back are going to be the same width. Because often I found they're not. And especially in women's clothing, they tend not to be. So the back is a bit more fitted, but you have more room in the front. So just be aware of that whenever you are putting together a vintage pattern, and especially if you're trying to like calculate how many stitches per inch, because the pattern itself may not tell you. Don't assume that the front and the back have the same width, because they may not. So the other interesting thing is that the actual curvature for the armhole is at a different rate from the front to the back. And it works itself out when you're putting the sleeve on, but just be aware that they are going to be different. But I've gotten that far in this, and that's been pretty cool. And I'm very much looking forward to being able to wear this. So maybe in like another week or two, I should have that one done. I just have a lot of projects going on. But luckily, one down with that shawl being finished. The other thing, and this is probably going to be a longer term one, you guys may remember this top. I had talked about it last week. Well, I have started to put the skirt on, and all I have done with this is I picked up stitches along the bottom of the crochet cast on edge, and then from there I set up the same sort of beginning pattern that there was on the top section. And I have been, let me see if I can turn this so you can actually see it, slowly increasing as I'm going along. And so what the point of this is, one, is that it's going to create a circle skirt. So I know it's going to fit over my hips and it's not going to be tight, because that is an area over my hips and my tummy that I just do not want something really tight. But also that once these little shells here get so wide, I'm then also going to split. So it's going to look very fractally when I'm done. And I'm going to work on using up the rest of this yarn that I have. Mostly because I have several projects in this, but it is not one of my favorite colors, and I want to be able to use it up in like one dress. One, because I only own one dress, and two, I think this will be really interesting and very different, and even if it doesn't work out, it's an experiment just as proof of concept as to what can be done, and then if I need to go back in and do any redesigns, I can. And I already have a few things I would change, like instead of having buttons, I would install a zipper on the side, just to aid in the putting on and taking off, because at a certain point it gets a little creative trying to wiggle in. But the skirt's working out really well. It's just going to take a while to make it long enough or to use up all of my yarn, whichever comes first. As another quick aside, for that particular pink blouse, I'm using a very simple, quick, and dirty trick, which is if you want to increase the size of lace, or really any knitting or crocheting, without changing stitch counts, you slowly go up a hook or needle size as you go along. So the bottom of this pink blouse, I am actually using a size 1B hook, and that is larger than the hook that I used for the top of that. So the bottom is automatically going to be a little bit larger, and it's making kind of like a circle skirt effect, which is really cool. And one of the next things that I kind of wanted to show you guys, I haven't made any progress on some of these other projects. My orange top that, again, I'm going to turn that into a dress as well, is kind of being held up until I can get this color work thing over here done, because I only have one set of size 2 needles, size 2 circular needles. But the other thing I wanted to show you guys. So last week I showed off some of the books that I use when I am designing for color work. How do I figure out what the charts are? How do I put them together? And the reference books that I use. But I was thinking about it and saying, okay, well, maybe not everyone wants to do stranded or color work, Fair Isle knitting like that. And I have also said that if you can, learn from everybody, because everybody's got something to teach you, even if it may not seem directly applicable right now. Our crafts are not as far apart as sometimes we are led to believe. There's not that big a difference between knitting and crocheting conceptually. The same thing for tatting, which I'm going to be learning how to do, but I've watched several videos on it, and I'm like, conceptually, it's not really all that different than crocheting. I'm just making different kinds of stitches, but I'm still using one string wrapped around itself to create a series of small knots. Knitting is one large interlocking knot. Crocheting, one large interlocking knot. Bobbin lace is essentially braiding. It's very complicated braiding, but it's basically braiding. Many other kinds of lace are not super duper different once you really start breaking them down to what their core essences are. And the same thing whenever you get into sewing, and you find this especially if you're working with vintage stuff, this here, just looking at the shoulder, how this is put together, this reads like a sewing pattern. Like somebody literally took a sewing pattern, laid it out, and then knitted pieces to fit the sewing pattern. So there's really not as much difference between, conceptually, some of the stuff for sewing and some of the stuff for knitting. You're still creating a shape using fabric and textiles. So learn from everybody. If you would like to learn some more about some color stuff, go to people who work with fabric, or go ahead and work with somebody who does cross stitch or embroidery, because they tend to work with large amounts of colors and they need to be able to blend them for certain things. And how do they go about doing that? How do they go about picking their colors? Could be an interesting detail. Anyway, the book that I had on my shelf that I wanted to go ahead and show you guys is this one. 5500 Quilt Block Designs. And the reason that I'm bringing this up is because I understand that not everyone wants to do Fair Isle. Sometimes you would, especially if you're working with a scrappier project, or sometimes you just want something that is TV knitting. It's a small section that you can work on, and it doesn't require a huge amount of thought. It has more solid colors. Maybe Fair Isle is just too busy for you. It's not your aesthetic. It's not what you like. So learning some of the quilt blocks and the designs in here may be very useful. This one, I've seen it at the library. I think my partner's dad found this for me years ago. It was just in one of his things. But as you go through, the quilt blocks start with something that is very simple, such as a very basic checkerboard. So block A, block B, block A, block B, or block A, block B, block B, block A. Creates a basic checkerboard. That's the same kind of thing that gets used in other knitting patterns when you're knitting different colored blocks, hexagon blocks, like the little puffed bits that you sew together. I can't think of the name of it. If I can think of it, I will put it on the screen somewhere. But it's the same kind of principle. Whenever you are looking at like some of the older crochet tablecloths that have specific motifs, little square motifs or triangular, or pick a shape, that are then sewn together, it's the same kind of principle. As long as your motifs are all the same size, you can work them together and it will come out just fine. So the other reason to look at this is so that you can then take a look at, say, a bunch of different motifs. If you wanted to do a sampler, how can I best integrate these triangular pieces together? And you may be able to use some of those, gain some inspiration out of here, or just using different colors, doing very simple squares, rectangles, and they're not triangles, they're half squares cut on the diagonal. If you talk to quilters, there's a very definite difference between a triangle and a half square. But the point is that conceptually you can take something that is a smaller bit of knitting or crocheting or pick-up craft, and how you can work it together using very simple shapes to create something that looks incredibly complex or just better fits your particular aesthetic. And I really do recommend go through some of those quilting books, because some of those quilting books can become very complex very, very quickly. Some of them work in circles, and each one of the patterns does have a different name. In flipping through here, so I'm not sure about some of the copyright on this, so I'm not going to show off some of the pictures in them, but I can tell in here. But what I can tell you, first off, this is written by Maggie Malone, 5500 Quilt Block Designs. Go ahead and look this one up. But each one of these quilt block designs does have a different name to it. And many of them are about taking basic tiles. So simple shapes. Again, these are things that you will be able to, work on in front of the TV. You can easily, you can turn one out one a night. and then how to take those very basic tiles, put them together into something that looks incredibly complex. And really, once you've broken it down, it's not super complex. The shapes are not complex. But once you put them all together, now it looks really wild. But yeah, look up your quilters. Anyway, like I said, I wanted to go ahead and show this one off because I understand not everybody likes the kind of color work that I tend to get into. And I encourage you to meet some of your other fellow crafters and start to have those conversations. I learned a lot about sewing so far in my journey, even though I don't sew. Like, that's the funny part. I can knit and crochet all day. I will probably start tatting very soon and be able to do that for hours. I've done finger weaving. I've done, some of the more complicated braiding. I can do all that stuff. Ask me to cut a straight line. Yeah, about that. Not my strong suit. I have taken the time to try to learn about sewing because I understand that sewing is an applicable skill for wrapping my head around the shapes within knitting. Wrapping my head around how do you make this? Like for this pink piece here, wrapping my head around how do I get these fluffy sleeves? Where do I gather for the top? How do I conceptually put together this skirt in a way that will allow me to plan a little bit better so I'm not walking in and just winging it? And all of those things are learning about other crafts, even if you don't particularly do them. I don't sew, but I know the principles of it. I understand the theoretical what is bag lining and how do you put that together. Because I know eventually it may become, I'm going to have to line this dress, this pink dress. It is very see-through. Because I never would have thought I would be doing that. So definitely step outside that comfort zone and at least give it a listen. Even if you don't do it, I think it is very beneficial. And that I would encourage pretty much every crafter to do that. Also, it creates a great sense of community and again, allows you to be able to share what you know. By all means, please share what you know, because if you don't share it, it will die with you. Anyway, there's that. And as a final note, you guys may notice that there's going to be some differences with some music going on. I'm trying very hard to learn some more of this editing, so I'm adding in some extra music and sound effects and things like that. So if it gets a little bit weird, I apologize, but I'm learning, and so I'm trying to figure out what is going to work for these videos and for me, what will give a really good kind of experience throughout these whole things. So thank you for your patience in advance. I'm trying to learn how to edit all this stuff together. There is a lot to learn, and good editing is invisible. Like, you don't even notice when it happens. And that's what it's supposed to do, though. It's supposed to be invisible. That's the great part of it. The same thing when you have done any other skill that requires large amounts of practice. You don't see the 10,000 hours of work that went into it. You just see someone doing an amazing backflip. So anyway, I'm trying to learn the editing, so if you get any music, that's kind of what's going on there. But I'll be sure to include some more of the pictures and other stuff from around my home of some of the different flowers that are coming up, and animals if I can catch them on camera. They are rather skittish around people, so that's an adventure. So yeah, that's what's been going on this week. Thanks for hanging out. If you've made it this far, I greatly appreciate it. And cool. I'll see you guys next week. Have fun. Make stuff. Bye.